Welcome back to the Diplomatic Lounge. Last time we were at the General Assembly of the United Nations in October 1963, when the Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, held a remarkable speech there. And today I promise to bring you again to the General Assembly, but to witness an event that I was there to see for myself. The day was December 7, 1988, and it was the day that Mikhail Gorbachev, then still the leader of the Soviet Union, made a very important statement at the UN. It had been a memorable day for New York already since morning. New Yorkers are used to chaos when the UN is in full session because so many heads of state are moving around town with their motorcades. But it was especially complicated that morning because Gorby, as he was known, was a bit of a rock star, and he had stopped his motorcade several times to greet the crowds. And with all that, security around the UN buildings was even stricter than usual, and even with all the badges, etc., I really made it just in time to witness the speech in the hall. It was a fairly long speech. The meeting started at 10:30. Gorbachev took the floor at 11 and he spoke till shortly after midday. And again, as I had done for Haile Selassie, I went to the archives to dig up the document. And here I have it. Wednesday, 7 December 1988, 10:30 a.m. One has to go all the way to practically the end of what was a long speech, here, page 27 of 33, to find the part that I think was the most important. What Gorbachev announced that day to me was nothing less than the end of the Cold War. Now, different dates have been assigned to the end of the Cold War. Obviously, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the implosion of the Soviet Union itself. But I think that day in December 88 was the first domino to fall that set all the rest in motion, because what Gorbachev announced in that passage towards the end of his long speech was the unilateral withdrawal of Soviet troops from the Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe, basically showing that the game was up. Now, I have said previously that when you're listening to all those speeches in the General Assembly, you often get a feeling of massive boredom. But that day was quite an exception, I have to say. There was a certain electricity in the air. It emanated from the man on the podium, and we all felt part of it. We really felt history in the making, and it's a very rare feeling that has always stayed etched in my memory. End of the Cold War. Well, to add some other personal reminiscences, I had also lived what was probably the worst moment of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, as a 10-year-old boy standing next to my grandmother in her kitchen in Antwerp. Now, my grandmother had lived through 2 world wars and German occupations, and she was convinced that she was in for the third one. She was mostly mumbling to herself, but also speaking to her 10-year-old grandson, when she said 2 interesting and funny things. First was, well, the Russians won't be any worse than the Germans. And the other one was, this time I'll have coffee and sugar for 4 years, because poor soul, she had been through all the scarcities and the deprivations of 4 war years, and she wanted to be prepared with a minimum of comfort for the one that was coming. We cannot forget, when we think back to Mr. Gorbachev that day in the UN, what has happened to the Soviet Union and to Russia since that day. Mr. Putin, who is presently the leader of Russia, is one of the heirs of Gorbachev. We have to see how things have deteriorated from the hope, again, created that day, to the present-day situation in Russia and what is going on. The death of Mr. Navalny, the ongoing war in Ukraine. How deep have we fallen from the hopes that were raised in December 1988. It's not very different from what we saw last time. Haile Selassie spoke at the UN at a brief moment of hope during the Cold War, and those hopes were dashed only a few months later when President Kennedy was assassinated. Now, the end of the Cold War by some has been seen as the end of history. It was in fact the resumption of history as normal, the history of centuries of warfare and tensions, a resumption to sometimes the worst parts of human nature as applied to world politics. Certainly, from Gorbachev to Putin, we have not gone forward. We can only hope that the pendulum of history one day moves again the other way. Thank you, and see you next time.